The autumn wind carried more than just the scent of dying leaves that October morning in 1884. It had the weight of winter's approach, the promise of hardship, and something else that made Beth Brennan's spine stiffen as she hung the last of the wash on the line behind her cabin. Her fingers, already red from the cold water, paused on a small shirt that belonged to her youngest, Tommy, only 4 years old and still asking when Papa would come home from the war that had ended 3 years ago. She'd stopped trying to explain death to children who barely understood yesterday from tomorrow. Instead, she filled their days with the rhythm of survival, the careful choreography of a woman alone with 3 small lives depending on her steady hands and stubborn heart. Margaret, her eldest at 10, helped with the cooking and minding her brothers. Samuel, 8, split kindling with fierce concentration, his small face serious beyond his years. And Tommy, bright-eyed Tommy, who still believed in fairy tales and heroes, spent his mornings collecting eggs and his afternoons following his mother like a devoted shadow. The cabin sat in a valley between 2 ridges, sheltered from the worst winds but isolated enough that neighbors were a day's ride away. Beth had chosen this place with her husband before the war, drawn by the creek that never ran dry and the meadow perfect for a garden. Now that same isolation felt different, pressing against her consciousness like a physical weight. She'd learned to sleep with one ear constantly listening, to pause in her work whenever the wind shifted, to read the behavior of their animals for signs of trouble approaching. This morning, the chickens scratched nervously at the dirt, their usual chatter subdued. The milk cow, Bessie, stood at the far edge of the pasture, her head raised and ears forward, staring at something Beth couldn't see. Even their old dog, Rusty, paced the porch with restless energy, occasionally releasing low growls that seemed to come from some deep instinct rather than any visible threat. Beth lifted the empty wash basket, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the growing unease in her chest. She'd learned not to show fear in front of the children, not to let them see how thin the line was between safety and disaster for a family with no man to protect them. The neighbors meant well when they stopped by, offering help with the heavier work or suggestions that she might consider moving to town, finding work as a seamstress, or taking in laundry. But this land was hers, bought with her husband's blood and her sweat, and she wouldn't be driven from it by loneliness or fear. She called the children in for their midday meal, watching as they responded immediately to the quiet authority in her voice. Margaret appeared first, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, her young face already showing the seriousness that came from being the oldest child in a household where responsibility couldn't wait for adulthood. Samuel emerged from behind the woodshed, dragging a piece of split oak nearly as tall as himself, his determination evident in every labored step. Tommy bounded from the chicken coop, his pockets bulging with eggs, his smile bright enough to chase away shadows. They gathered around the simple wooden table Beth's husband had built during their first winter here, when hope still felt like something they could hold in their hands rather than something that might slip away with the following harsh wind. The meal was simple yet filling, consisting of cornbread and beans flavored with a hint of ham from the pig they'd slaughtered earlier in the season. Beth watched her children eat, noting how Margaret automatically gave half her portion to Tommy, how Samuel saved the most significant piece of cornbread for his mother without being asked, how Tommy chattered about the new chicks that had hatched the day before. his voice filling the spaces that adult conversation might have occupied in another household. After the meal, Beth sent the boys to gather firewood while she and Margaret worked on mending clothes by the window. The afternoon light was growing thin, autumn's brief days already shortening toward winter's long darkness. Margaret's needle moved with practiced efficiency, her stitches small and even. Another skill learned too early by necessity. Beth found herself studying her daughter's profile, seeing echoes of her own mother in the serious set of Margaret's mouth, the careful way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. 3 generations of women learning to make do, to stretch provisions and patience, to find strength in the simple act of continuing when everything else had been stripped away. The sound of horses approaching came just as the sun touched the western ridge, their hoofbeats carrying clearly in the still air. Beth's needle paused, her body going alert in the way that had become second nature over the past months of solitude. She moved to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain, and counted the riders as they came into view. Too many for a neighborly visit, their posture wrong for men with honest business. She recognized the type immediately, though she'd never seen these particular faces before. Hard men who took what they wanted and called it justice, who saw a woman alone as an invitation rather than a person deserving respect. Margaret looked up from her sewing, reading the tension in her mother's stillness. Without being told, she set aside her work and crept toward the back of the cabin where her brothers were stacking wood. Beth heard her whisper urgently to the boys, listened to the immediate silence that followed. Smart children, children who'd learned to listen when the grown-ups spoke in certain tones, children who'd already experienced enough of the world's dangers to know when stillness might mean survival. Beth remained at the window, watching as the riders arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the front of her property. 20 men, she counted, more than enough to take whatever they wanted by force if they chose. But she'd learned something about predators during these months of isolation, learned that showing fear was like bleeding in front of wolves. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the door with the same calm deliberation she brought to every task, from milking cows to comforting nightmares. Her rifle hung above the fireplace, loaded and ready, though she knew the arithmetic of 20 against 1 left little room for optimism. The leader dismounted with careless confidence, his spurs ringing against the porch boards as he approached her door. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of swagger that came from never having met meaningful resistance. When he knocked, the sound was loud and demanding, a fist against wood that seemed to say he was already inside, already taking what he pleased. Beth opened the door before he could knock again, meeting his eyes steadily, her hand resting on the door frame in a way that managed to be both welcoming and territorial. Behind her, she could feel her children's presence, could sense Margaret holding the boys close, all of them silent as stones. The man's grin was wide and empty of warmth, his eyes taking inventory of her property, her solitude, her vulnerability with the casual assessment of someone accustomed to measuring what he could take against what might resist him. The bandit leader's smile revealed teeth stained yellow from tobacco, and when he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of a man who'd grown accustomed to being obeyed without question. He gestured broadly at the cabin, the barn, the small garden, where the last tomatoes still hung heavy on their vines despite the frost warnings that had painted the morning grass silver. Beth could smell the whiskey on his breath even from arm's length. Could see the way his eyes lingered on details that told him everything he thought he needed to know about her circumstances. Behind him, his men had dismounted with the casual efficiency of wolves surrounding prey. Their movements coordinated enough to suggest this wasn't their first time visiting isolated homesteads. Some checked the barn and outbuildings, while others positioned themselves to block any escape routes, their weapons visible, but not yet drawn. A show of overwhelming force designed to make resistance seem foolish rather than brave. Beth noted each position, cataloged every face, and felt the familiar cold calculation that had kept her alive through childbirth, disease, crop failures, and the grinding loneliness of the past year settling over her thoughts like armor. The leader introduced himself as Ezra Cobb, though Beth suspected that name was as temporary as his charm. He spoke of hard times and harder men, of the need for communities to support traveling folks who'd fallen on misfortune. His words wrapping extortion in the language of neighborly cooperation. His men needed food, he explained. Their horses required grain, and surely a Christian woman wouldn't turn away hungry travelers, especially when those travelers had the means to express their gratitude for such kindness in more permanent ways. Beth listened without speaking, her face composed in the careful neutrality she'd learned from watching her mother deal with difficult men, from observing how resistance could be shown through stillness rather than confrontation. When Cobb finished his elaborate justification for what he intended to take anyway, she nodded once. She stepped back from the doorway, not an invitation, but in the measured retreat of someone choosing her ground rather than having it chosen for her. She moved through her cabin with deliberate calm, gathering supplies with the same methodical care she brought to any task. Bread from the pantry, preserved vegetables from the root cellar, enough to feed 20 men one meal, but not sufficient to sustain them through an extended stay. She worked quietly, efficiently, while her children remained in the back room. Margaret's whispered instructions barely audible as she organized her brothers for whatever might come next. Beth's rifle remained above the fireplace, seemingly forgotten, though her awareness of its location never wavered. Cobb followed her movements with lazy interest, commenting on the tidiness of her home, the apparent prosperity of someone who would manage their resources well, the unfortunate vulnerability of a woman trying to maintain such a place without proper protection. His implications grew less subtle with each observation, his suggestions about ongoing arrangements and regular visits carrying threats wrapped in the pretense of neighborly concern. Beth continued her preparations without responding, her silence neither defiant nor submissive, but something more dangerous, the quiet of someone thinking, rather than reacting. When she'd assembled the requested supplies, Beth began loading them into baskets with the same careful attention she gave to packing eggs for market, each item placed with consideration for weight and balance. Cobb moved closer, his presence intended to intimidate, to remind her of her physical disadvantage, to press the point that cooperation was her only reasonable choice. He reached out to touch her shoulder, a gesture meant to establish dominance, to reduce her to the status of property, to be handled rather than a person to be respected. Beth stepped sideways, not quickly enough to seem like retreat, but smoothly enough to avoid his touch without making it appear accidental. She lifted one of the heavy baskets, testing its weight, then looked directly at Cobb for the first time since she had opened her door. Her eyes held no fear, no anger, just the flat assessment of someone measuring odds and making calculations. When she spoke, her voice was steady, conversational, almost friendly. She told him the food was ready, that his men were welcome to it, but that they'd need to move along before dark, since she had children to protect and work to finish before winter's arrival. Her tone suggested this was a simple statement of fact rather than a request, the kind of practical observation one neighbor might make to another about timing and responsibilities. Cobb's smile faltered slightly, perhaps surprised by her failure to acknowledge the power dynamics he'd assumed were obvious to everyone present. He stepped closer again, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a persuasive whisper, explaining that a woman in her position might benefit from ongoing protection, that arrangements could be made to ensure her safety and her children's welfare in exchange for reasonable cooperation. His hand moved toward her waist, no longer pretending the gesture was casual. His intentions clear enough that even the most charitable interpretation would have to acknowledge their nature. Beth shifted the basket to her other arm, the movement bringing her closer to the fireplace, closer to the rifle that hung in its familiar place above the mantelpiece. Her children had gone completely silent in the back room, their absence from normal childhood noise creating a tension that seemed to press against the cabin's walls. She could feel Margaret's fierce attention, could sense Samuel's coiled readiness, could imagine Tommy's wide eyes taking in everything without understanding any of it. The moment stretched like a wire under increasing tension, Cobb's confidence beginning to show cracks as Beth's refusal to respond according to his expectations created uncertainty in what should have been a straightforward transaction. Outside, his men were growing restless, their horses stamping and snorting in the cooling air, their own awareness of the approaching darkness adding urgency to whatever their leader intended to accomplish. Beth set down the basket with careful deliberation, her movements economical and precise. When she straightened, something had changed in her posture, some subtle shift from the accommodating widow to something more challenging, more dangerous. Her hand rested casually on the mantelpiece, inches from the rifle stock. Her body balanced in a way that suggested capability rather than vulnerability. When she finally spoke again, her words carried a weight entirely different. She explained that she'd fed them as requested, that they'd had their rest, and that now it was time for them to leave her property and her children in peace. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath the courtesy, an acknowledgement that they'd reached the end of what she was willing to give without taking something in return. Cobb's face darkened, his pretense of civilization slipping as his authority was questioned by someone who should have been grateful for whatever scraps of mercy he chose to offer. The explosion came without warning, Cobb's patience finally exhausted by Beth's refusal to play her assigned role in his familiar script. His hand shot out to grab her arm, his voice rising to a roar as he explained exactly what he intended to take and how little her preferences mattered in the face of 20 armed men who decided she had things they wanted. His grip was meant to hurt, to remind her of her physical disadvantage, to reduce the situation to its simplest terms of force and submission. Beth's response was immediate and devastating. Her free hand closed around the rifle stock, swinging it down and around in one fluid motion that spoke of practice, preparation, and absolute commitment to protecting what was hers. The wooden stock caught Cobb across the temple with a sound like splitting kindling, dropping him to his knees and sending blood streaming down his face. Before he could recover, before his men could react to their leader's sudden vulnerability. Beth had the rifle leveled and ready, her finger steady on the trigger, her voice cutting through the sudden chaos. With crystalline clarity, she announced that the first man to draw a weapon would watch Cobb die, that the second would follow him, and that any of them still interested in testing a widow's resolve after that were welcome to discover what 3 years of hunting to feed her children had taught her about marksmanship. Her tone suggested she was discussing the weather rather than making threats, the kind of practical observation that carried more weight than any amount of bluster or bravado. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours. 20 armed men suddenly uncertain about their overwhelming advantage, their leader bleeding and dazed at their fate, a woman with calm eyes and steady hands holding a rifle that could drop any one of them before they could clear leather. Beth's children remained hidden, but present, their silence adding another layer of motivation to her resolve, their need for protection lending weight to the promises she was prepared to keep, regardless of the personal cost. Margaret's voice came softly, but clearly from the back room, announcing that she had her father's pistol and knew how to use it, that Samuel was covering the back door with the shotgun, and that anyone thinking about flanking maneuvers might want to reconsider their approach. The children had been listening, learning, preparing for this moment with the same grim determination their mother brought to every aspect of their survival. The tactical situation had shifted in ways that made experienced men uncomfortable, their numerical advantage suddenly complicated by prepared defenders, limited sight lines, and the knowledge that desperate people with nothing left to lose made dangerous opponents regardless of age or gender. Beth waited for their calculations to reach the obvious conclusion, her rifle never wavering, her breathing steady and controlled, her finger ready to turn threats into action the moment anyone decided to test her resolve. One by one, Cobb's men began backing toward their horses, their movements careful and deliberate, hands visible and empty. They helped their leader to his feet, supporting his weight as blood continued to stream from the gash Beth's rifle stock had opened above his ear. Cobb's eyes promised future retribution, but his immediate focus was on staying conscious long enough to retreat with whatever dignity the situation might allow. Beth followed them onto the porch, her rifle tracking their movements as her children emerged to stand beside her, their weapons at the ready. Margaret held her father's service pistol with both hands, her young face set in lines that belonged on someone much older. Samuel gripped the shotgun across his chest, his small frame dwarfed by the weapon, but his determination was evident in every rigid line of his posture. Even Tommy appeared, clutching a kitchen knife that was probably more dangerous to himself than to any potential enemies, his presence adding symbolic weight to the family's unified resistance. They mounted up slowly, their leader swaying in his saddle, their earlier confidence replaced by the sullen awareness that they'd badly miscalculated the nature of their intended victims. Beth watched them wheel their horses toward the trail that led away from her valley, their departure lacking the swagger that had marked their arrival. She kept her rifle ready until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, until the last dust cloud disappeared beyond the ridge, until silence returned to her small homestead like a blessing finally acknowledged. The children gathered around her as darkness claimed the valley, their weapons set aside, their bodies trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Beth pulled them close, feeling the rapid beat of their hearts against her ribs, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair and skin, while her pulse gradually slowed to normal rhythms. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice shaky but proud as she announced that she'd been ready to shoot, that she wouldn't have let anyone hurt her mother or brothers. Samuel nodded in agreement, his serious face made more solemn by the weight of what they'd just experienced together. Even Tommy, too young to fully understand the danger they'd faced, seemed to sense the significance of the moment, the way his family had stood together against something larger and more threatening than anything in his limited experience. Beth held them all, feeling the fierce protective love that had given her strength to face 20 armed men without flinching, without backing down, without surrendering an inch of the ground her husband's sacrifice had bought. They stood together on the porch as the first stars appeared overhead, the rifle leaning against the door frame within easy reach. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight and the promise of warmth, safety, and continuity. Beth knew the bandits might return. That word would spread about the widow who'd drawn blood and sent grown men running, that their isolation made them vulnerable to future threats. But she also knew something else, something that sang in her bones like a hymn of defiance and determination. She'd proven to herself and her children that their home was worth fighting for, that family was stronger than fear, that love could make even the smallest offender capable of standing against overwhelming odds. The land beneath their feet felt more solid somehow, more truly theirs for having been defended, rather than simply inherited. The cabin walls seemed sturdier, the fence lines more permanent, the future more secure for having been bought with courage, rather than given through charity. Margaret helped her mother check the doors and windows while Samuel banked the fire for the night, and Tommy gathered his scattered toys from where they'd been abandoned when the riders first appeared. Regular activities resumed with grateful efficiency, the household settling into evening routines that felt precious for having been threatened and preserved. Beth cleaned her rifle and returned it to its place above the fireplace, ready for immediate use, but no longer the center of their attention. Over the following days, word spread through the scattered community faster than Beth had expected. Neighbors appeared with offers of help, supplies, and awkward expressions of respect for what she'd accomplished. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do, until 20 bandits became an army and Beth Brennan became something approaching legend. She accepted the attention with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else, neither boasting about her actions nor downplaying their significance. The children resumed their everyday activities, but with a new confidence, knowing that their family was capable of protecting itself and that their mother's strength was something they could depend on when everything else seemed uncertain. Margaret began asking about learning to shoot properly, not out of fear, but from a desire to contribute more effectively to their collective security. Samuel practiced with the shotgun until he could load and aim it without struggling under its weight. Even Tommy insisted on being taught how to bar the doors and windows. His young mind understood that safety was something the family created together, rather than something that simply happened to them. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Beth found herself changed by the confrontation in ways she hadn't expected. The isolation that had once felt like vulnerability now felt like strength. The distance from neighbors a source of independence rather than danger. She'd discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, had learned that desperation could be transformed into determination when filtered through love for her children and respect for the life she and her husband had built together. The cabin seemed larger somehow, more spacious for housing people who'd proven their worth to themselves and each other. The valley felt more like home. The ridges more like protection than isolation. The creek more like a blessing than a simple convenience. Beth's garden had survived the first frost. Her livestock remained healthy and productive. And her children grew stronger each day under the influence of parents who taught them that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. When the first snow fell, blanketing their small homestead in pristine white, Beth stood on her porch with her children beside her, watching the flakes drift down like promises of peace, renewal, and the continuation of life despite every effort to interrupt its flow. The rifle remained ready above the fireplace. The children's weapons stayed within reach, but fear no longer dominated their planning or shaped their dreams. They'd face the worst their circumstances could offer and emerge intact, unified, stronger than they'd been before the test came calling. The wind that had carried omens of danger now carried the scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and the indefinable perfume of a home where love had proven stronger than fear, where courage had been discovered rather than lost, where a widow and her children had written their own story of survival and strength against overwhelming odds. Beth Brennan had become a legend, not through supernatural powers or impossible luck, but through the simple recognition that some battles must be fought regardless of their outcome. Some ground must be defended regardless of the cost. And some love burns bright enough to light the way through any darkness that dares to test its flame. If this tale of unexpected love born from the darkest of circumstances touched your heart, if you believe that even in the harshest frontier towns, true love can bloom where least expected, then you've found your home with Maverick Hearts. Here we bring you more than just romance. We bring you the raw truth of survival, the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken, and the kind of love that rises from ashes to build something beautiful and lasting. If stories like this one stir something profound in your soul, if you hunger for more tales of redemption on the untamed frontier, make sure to show this story some love with a like. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another journey into the wild heart of the American West, where love was hard won, but worth fighting for. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you new stories of courage, passion, and the unbreakable human spirit that tamed a continent one heart at a time.